The walls of the Kremlin are beginning to tremble, not from bombs, not from missiles, but from something far more dangerous to a regime like Putin's: economic collapse. Russia, once soaring on oil revenues and oligarch wealth, is now sliding into a financial abyss. And here's the most shocking twist. The very ally Putin relied on most, China, is quietly stepping away. Chinese banks are shutting off money flows, leaving Moscow scrambling to stay afloat. Could this be the final nail in the coffin for Putin's war machine? For more than 2 decades, Putin sold Russia as a fortress of stability, a country where oligarchs flaunted unimaginable wealth and energy exports poured billions into state coffers. But today, that image is cracking. Russia's economy is bleeding, and no amount of propaganda can hide it. Food shortages are worsening. Store shelves are thinning. Families are being torn apart by unemployment, falling wages, and soaring prices. Billions of rubles are disappearing into the black hole of the war effort, while ordinary Russians protest quietly inside their own homes. But it's not just money that's running out. It's people. The war is consuming Russia's youth, while millions flee abroad to escape conscription or economic despair. Factories are short on workers. Even Russia's Ministry of Labor admits the country could face a shortage of nearly 11 million workers by 2030. To plug the gaps, Moscow is importing migrant labor, but it's nowhere near enough. And as the workforce disappears, Putin clings to his last remaining pillar: oil and gas. But here's the disaster. Oil is no longer a guaranteed lifeline. Russian refineries are under attack. Around 13.5% are already offline. Reserves are shrinking, and the global market is turning away. The so-called energy superpower is slowly losing its power. This leads us to the most dramatic betrayal of all. For years, Russia leaned heavily on China as its economic lifeline, convinced Beijing would never allow Moscow to fall. But reality tells a colder story. Chinese banks, fearing Western sanctions, are cutting financial ties with Russia. Deals are delayed, transactions canceled, entire money flows shut down. Even small regional banks in China are refusing to process Russian business. The Kremlin believed Asia would replace the West, but the opposite is happening. Payments now move through convoluted intermediaries, split transactions, and shadow routes. Every step takes longer, costs more, and draws unwanted attention. The financial lifeline is fraying, and Putin knows it. Imagine the humiliation, the so-called partnership without limits reduced to improvised money tricks. This isn't just inconvenient, it's deadly for Russia's economy. Inside the Kremlin, the numbers no longer work. Defense spending is exploding, while oil and gas revenues collapse under sanctions and deep discounts. The government is burning through reserves at alarming speed. Budget deficits are already blown halfway through the year. Every ruble spent on tanks and missiles is one less for hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. Interest rates remain painfully high, choking investment as domestic demand weakens. Businesses hesitate. Consumers pull back. Growth forecasts sink month after month. Russia is trapped in what economists call a narrow corridor. Every option, raising taxes, printing money, cutting budgets, creates even more pain. And with Chinese banks pulling away, that corridor is rapidly closing. But Moscow's crisis isn't only financial. Ukraine is exploiting Russia's weaknesses with ruthless precision. Take the Novokubantsk oil refinery, one of Russia's largest. Ukraine struck it with 17 drones, knocking out more than 4% of Russia's refining capacity in a single night. Even worse, this was the second strike on the same facility in just 3 weeks. This is no accident. It's strategy. By repeatedly hitting oil infrastructure more than 1,000 kilometers inside Russian territory, Ukraine is sending a clear message: nowhere in Western Russia is safe. Every refinery, every industrial plant, every energy hub now sits under constant threat. For Beijing, this is a nightmare. Why pour billions into supporting Russia if Ukraine can erase that value overnight? Backing Putin increasingly looks like throwing money into a fire, and China understands that. Meanwhile, Russia's wealthy elite, the same oligarchs who once toasted champagne on luxury yachts, are starting to panic. Their protected bubble has burst. Suspicious deaths, mysterious disappearances, and forced nationalizations are ripping through Russia's elite. Billionaires are watching as their companies are seized, their assets stripped away, and their futures erased. One of Russia's largest gold producers, Zoloto, was taken by the state through a swift court ruling. Airports, logistics hubs, and even farms are being nationalized under these vague war economy laws. The message is unmistakable and, honestly, terrifying. Property is no longer safe. In today's Russia, not even billionaires are beyond the Kremlin's reach. For investors, this means only one thing: get out. Capital is fleeing. Projects are frozen. Long-term planning has become, well, impossible. The result is economic stagnation, with no visible path to recovery. And as if the situation weren't dire enough, Europe is not easing the pressure. Sanctions are expanding, now targeting Russia's last remaining escape routes. Shadow fleets, intermediary channels, and loopholes designed to evade restrictions. The goal is clear: cut off Russia's ability to sell oil, import critical technology, and move money abroad. Each new round of sanctions makes it harder for Moscow to hide, harder for China to help, and harder for Russia to survive. The consequences are unavoidable: rising costs, shrinking revenues, and deepening isolation. So where does this leave Beijing? Xi Jinping faces a dangerous calculation. On one side, supporting Putin could secure access to Russia's vast energy reserves. On the other, it risks devastating blowback from the West: tariffs, military pressure in Asia, and an economic confrontation China wants no part of. Europe could align tariffs with the United States, crushing Chinese exports. NATO could expand its footprint in Asia. For Beijing, the price of saving Putin is simply too high. That's why Chinese banks are freezing deals. That's why even cautious financial lifelines are being cut. Beijing understands that Putin is no longer worth the risk. Back in Russia, ordinary citizens are paying the price. Food prices rise, rents soar, fuel costs climb, endless bills grind down daily life. Families postpone basic purchases, consumption collapses, even modest household dreams disappear. The so-called war economy creates jobs, but without productivity. Factories churn out weapons instead of consumer goods, while living standards steadily rot. Inflation remains high. Purchasing power erodes. Psychological exhaustion spreads across society. For ordinary Russians, the invisible war tax is everywhere: at the supermarket, at the gas pump, on the electricity bill. The Kremlin can silence protests in the streets, but it cannot silence empty wallets at home. The hard truth is this: Russia's economy is not merely slowing down, it is approaching collapse. Without trust, without rule of law, without secure property rights or financial stability, no investor will commit, no bank will lend, and no economy can endure. Every signal points toward bankruptcy, not just in courtrooms, but in everyday life. Factories are closing, banks are tightening credit, investors are fleeing, oligarchs are moving wealth abroad. All of it screams the same message: the system is unsustainable, the elites know it, the banks know it, even China knows it. And that is why Beijing is stepping back, refusing to mortgage its future for Putin's failing empire. In the end, Russia's crisis is more than numbers on a spreadsheet. It is the unraveling of a nation's future. From labor shortages to collapsing oil revenues, from Chinese banks shutting their doors to oligarchs running for the exits, the message is unmistakable. The Putin era is reaching its breaking point, and as China turns away, Russia stands more isolated than ever. Its economy strangled, its elites panicked, its people suffering. What began as a war to expand influence may end with Russia bankrupt, broken, and abandoned by its so-called friends. The real question now isn't whether Russia can survive this storm. It's how much longer the Kremlin can keep the illusion alive before the entire system finally implodes.